Last week, we talked about how Langdon Winner was concerned with the idea that we may be sleepwalking, that we may be walking through and using technologies without really stopping to assess how they serve us, if they serve us, who they affect, how they affect them. And in so doing, that we can open our eyes and be conscientious of the world that we're creating, because each technology creates a new possibility in the world. So with that in mind, let's look at this week's technology and see how it functions for us. See if we agree with how it functions for us. So one of the tools that we can use in order to do that is to look at comparison as a tool. If you notice, this department is called Comparative Studies. And the reason why is the focus of the department is to look at things that are unfamiliar. So perhaps that's looking at a different context, whether historical, whether cultural, geographical, looking at a different context and seeing, okay, how does something that feels exotic or unfamiliar or peculiar or strange, how is it actually perhaps familiar in different ways if we apply it to a social context that's familiar to us? So if we understand it better, can it become familiar for us? Likewise, can we take something that feels familiar to us, that feels kind of natural, that feels everyday, sort of something that we just may take for granted, and can we make it unfamiliar through the process of comparison? Can we make it peculiar? Can we make it strange? And maybe in this way, we can wake up ourselves from this sort of sleepwalking that Langdon Winner last week was concerned with. So what does that mean for us? Let's take a look at this week's readings. Let's take a look at, what's his name? Let's take a look at Stephen Jay Gould's reading from this week. Let's see how he uses comparison. So he takes something that we're somewhat familiar with, the IQ test. We certainly know that it has a large impact on our society. We've seen it impact sort of social ranking. We've seen it inform some of the tests that we take, standardized testing that we take maybe to get into college or during high school. And take a deeper look at it by tracing how it was used in different contexts. So let's get into it.
This video is intended to show the way that Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, uses comparison as a methodological tool to make his point. Remember that as I summarize, I'll be reading some quotes from the text, and so for page numbers, please refer to the video transcript. This book, The Mismeasure of Man, was published in 1981, and it critiques the arguments and methods Western scientists have frequently applied in their search to define intelligence. Gould begins by talking about the French scientist Alfred Binet. He was looking for ways to measure intelligence, and he put together a series of tasks that he thought would be able to assess somebody's logic. So these were, quote, short tasks related to everyday problems of life. These tasks included things like counting coins, assessing which face is prettier, for example, which is kind of weird. He argued that it matters very little what the tests are as long as they are numerous. And, quote, he hoped that by mixing together enough tests of different abilities, he would be able to abstract a child's general potential with a single score, end quote. Eventually, this number came to be known as the intelligence quotient, or IQ. And according to Gould, Binet was developing this system in order to help special needs students who would benefit from more customized education. Many of Binet's ideas were lost in translation when they came to America. H.H. Goddard is the second main scholar Gould discusses. Goddard, an American researcher, was a major force in establishing IQ tests across America. He ignored all three main principles Binet suggested. Unlike Binet, he argued that IQ tests determined innate intelligence, were exacting, and should be tested on all children in order to segregate and control those with lower IQ results. According to him, feeble-minded people, which is what he called them, should be controlled, kept from breeding, and institutionalized, which of course he was more than happy to accommodate with his own institutions. Immigrants and racial minorities were considered a part of the lower levels of the taxonomy. By 1917, he was bragging about having deported people deemed feeble-minded by 570% more than previous years. What's more is that when Goddard and his colleagues administered these IQ tests, they adapted test results to fit their conclusions by omitting, reinterpreting, or intuiting data. By 1928, even Goddard himself seemed skeptical of his conclusions. He critiqued several of his earlier conclusions by saying that counter to what he said before, 1, feeble-mindedness is not incurable, and 2, the feeble-minded do not generally need to be segregated in institutions. The last scholar we'll look at is Lewis M. Terman. Terman was a professor at Stanford, and Gould credits him with having popularized IQ tests in America. Terman agreed with Goddard that intelligence was innate, though admitted to having no data to support this claim. Terman added many questions to the original IQ tests. One of his test questions said something like this: my neighbor had a doctor, then lawyer, then minister enter his house. What event happened? Well, while there are a range of lots of creative and logical responses, Terman only accepted the response that someone had died. Another example of his test questions goes something like this. An Indian sees a white man riding down the street and thinks the white man is lazy because he walks sitting down. What does the Indian see? Well, apart from the questionable question, one might have said that the white man was riding on a horse or a car, but for Terman, the only acceptable answer was a bicycle. Keep in mind that Binet had wanted only highly trained people to administer his tests, but now everyone across the country was creating their own versions. So my mom told me a story recently from when my aunt was in school in the 1950s. She took an IQ test, and one of the directions was to circle which images displayed were household objects. One image was of a drying machine. My aunt had never seen one before because they had only ever hung out clothes to dry. Since she did not circle the picture of the drying machine as a household object, she lost points on her IQ test. Like Goddard, Terman believed people with lower IQ results were dangerous and should be eliminated. In 1917, Terman asked his colleague Catherine M. Cox to assist him in determining the IQ of many acclaimed people who are now dead, people like Copernicus or Shakespeare. She assigned IQ scores arbitrarily and based on little to no data. She often gave extra points to acclaim people with higher socioeconomic class. If someone she admired, like Shakespeare, did not score a high enough IQ, she excluded them from the study. Gould's main point is that H.H. Goddard and Lewis M. Terman's work is filled with logical fallacies, excluded information, or imaginary data. By 1937, even Terman himself seemed to prefer the idea that intelligence was not innate, but instead had more to do with environment or educational access. The question here then is, how does Gould use the process of comparison to make his point? What is he saying about the IQ test and how it was used in different contexts? He has one opinion about it. Of course, we can discuss what our opinions about it are as well.
So how do we think about the process of comparison used in this book? I think Gould is pretty explicit about his point or his opinion about these different actors in the construction of the IQ test. But I think for us, the job is to look and see how this test, which is familiar to us in one way, becomes unfamiliar when we look at its original context in France. I think that what's important to note also is that people are maybe not all equally asleep when it comes to different technologies. If you are in a group of people that is being systematically disenfranchised by this IQ test, you may have some more skepticism of it. So we may all have very different relationships to different technologies. In fact, I'm sure that we do. And I think that is also important to note. And so it is through these conversations that we can, as a group, as a community, decide how these function for us and what we want to do with them.